The factory shock assemblies on your Expedition were never much to write home about in the first place, and after some serious miles in use, their performance and overall ride quality can take a serious nosedive. Luckily, Bilstein's B6 4600 series shock assemblies are here to save the day and get your SUV back to the ride quality and general performance that it really deserves. We'll start in the front end, and after removing the wheels, we will have access to the front suspension. Start off with removing the front axle dust cover and unbolting the axle nut in the hub. The sway bar can be removed from the end link on each side of the truck next, then swing up off the end link. You might need a hammer to persuade it depending on how your Expedition's condition is. Move on to the tie rod end and unbolt it from the knuckle. Side note, you can see our penetrating oil we sprayed earlier to make everything easier. Again, a hammer may be needed to break it loose. Up at the knuckle, we unbolted the brake line brackets and ABS sensor line to get more slack for when we unbolt the knuckle. We followed the brake lines up along the frame as well and removed them where we could. We are ready to unbolt the upper control arm from the knuckle, but leave the nut threaded on a few turns so that we can break it loose from the knuckle with a few blows from a hammer. Then take a pry bar to relieve the tension, remove the nut, and take the UCA out of the knuckle. If your axle vacuum line is stressed at this point, it can be removed if needed. A trick we have learned is that loosening the upper control arm just slightly at the frame will take all of the tension off and allow the upper control arm to rotate completely out of the way of the coilover assembly on removal. Just something to make life easier. Moving on to the top 3 nuts on the strut, fully remove these and then prop up your upper control arm. For a bit of extra room, you can pry out the axle from the knuckle a tad. Then we are ready to unbolt the lower shock mount and remove the coilover from the truck. With the coilover out, attach your spring compressor and evenly tighten each side to compress the spring. Once compressed enough, remove the nut on the cap of the coilover. It is smart to mark the cap for reference on reinstallation later so the 3 bolts line up with the shock tower. Once the spring is separated from the stock shock, slide off the lower spring perch and bump stop. These can both be transferred to the new Bilstein shock. Then add the washer to the shock shaft and mate the shock to the stock spring. Then add the cap, making sure it lines up with the lower shock mount using your reference marks made earlier. Then tighten the top nut and release your spring compressor. You can now replace the coilover assembly into the shock tower, and yes, we did add a lift spacer to our Expedition, but regardless, your installation will not be affected with the stock setup. Now remove your sophisticated towel holder apparatus, then slide the coilover into its upper mounts and loosely tighten the upper mounts of the spacer into the shock mount. Line up the lower control arm with the shock mount and slide in the bolt. Now that the coilover is attached on both ends, you can tighten the lower mount. Next, we slightly jacked up on the lower control arm to get a little extra clearance for the upper control arm and slide it back into the knuckle and fully tighten it down. Any and all brake lines that were removed earlier for clearance can be replaced to the knuckle and frame, along with the axle vacuum line. Finishing up on the front end, tighten the 3 upper coilover nuts. Then replace the axle nut. Do not over-tighten the axle nut, for you will run the risk of breaking it off the axle shaft. Torque back down your upper control arm frame mounts, then you can insert the tie rod back into the knuckle and replace the sway bar to the end link to complete the front install. Moving on to the rear, remove the 3 nuts in the top of the strut assembly, but to reach the rear nut we had to unbolt the brake line bracket and move it aside. Following suit with the front end, remove the lower control arm mount to free the coilover. Loosen but do not fully remove the lower control arm mount in the knuckle, then remove the lower control arm from the frame mount. It has a flag nut on the back side. Once removed, swing the control arm aside enough to pull the coilover from the truck. You can now again attach the spring compressor to the spring. You will notice how we marked our coilover cap again to ensure it's in the correct position upon reinstallation. Now evenly tighten the compressor to take the tension off the cap. Then remove the upper shock nut. We next removed our spring compressor and pulled the factory shock from the spring. Remove the bump stop to reuse, then flip the shock over and hammer off the lower spring perch. Transfer it to the new shock, followed by the bump stop and upper washer. Insert the assembled shock into the spring along with the coilover cap. Make sure everything is lined up like factory and tighten down the upper shock nut. If the cap goes out of alignment, place the coilover in a vise and rotate the cap with a pry bar. Now place the coilover back into the control arm and tighten the upper bolts in the top of the shock tower. Then slide the lower control arm over and tighten the bolt at the knuckle. Before replacing the control arm to the frame mount, attach the shock to the control arm with the stock hardware. Jack up the control arm now to align the frame mounts. It will take some persuasion, but slide in the bolt when you get them lined up. Start tightening the control arm to the frame and the shock to the control arm. Move on to the top 3 shock nuts, then replace the brake line bracket into the frame to complete the rear install. While these shock assemblies do not provide any ride height increase, they were specifically designed to improve performance and refresh ride quality as a drop-in replacement. And while we did add a lift spacer to our Expedition to get some extra height for larger tires, these Bilsteins were the perfect complement for on and off-road use.